Hello, and welcome to the Road to Autonomy Podcast. I am your host, Grayson Brulte. The Road to Autonomy Podcast is brought to you in part by Florida Internet and Television. It's time to cut the tax on tech. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Road to Autonomy. I am your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to have Jonny Morris, Head of Public Policy for Embark. Welcome to the podcast, Jonny.
Thanks, Grayson. Really happy to be here.
Oh, we're super excited to have you, and it's really timely to have this conversation. Now, you've had experience with the Obama administration, so really looking forward to it.
Yeah.
With 2020 being a presidential election year, will you please kindly talk about your experience working on the Obama-Biden presidential transition team in 2008?
Yeah, sure. That was a really fun time. I had just come out of grad school and was living in D.C. I actually had a job at the State Department and I was waiting for my security clearance. And so I was just kind of hanging out. I was interning at a think tank and just ended up meeting some people that were involved in the Obama transition and expressed some interest in pitching in. And so I got this call like a couple weeks before the election. It was very cryptic. It just basically said, if Senator Obama wins, the next day at 8 a.m., show up at this address. And so I showed up, and it was this nondescript federal building in downtown DC that was chock full of campaign people that had just flown from Chicago. And yeah, it was like a full sprint from the day after the election to inauguration, working 6 or 7 days a week, 12 plus hours a day. But it was super gratifying and really felt like being a part of history.
So if you look at history, and we all watch movies, and movies tend to exaggerate things, you're working in the State Department, you get a cryptic note to go to a building. Do you think that this is like some CIA thing that you're getting a new job that you don't know about yet?
No, I mean, I knew it was the campaign folks, and I had an idea that it was the transition, but I didn't know exactly who was involved because it's very like compartmentalized and you're not supposed to tell anybody else. So I was, I showed up and then like I knew some people there and it was like, oh, you're here. You knew about this. So yeah. And then it was just, hitting the ground running. And I was kind of an odd duck because most of the folks there were political folks that had come from the campaign. And I was this kind of like, future civil servant. So I was on like a little bit different track, but it was great. I mean, I made a bunch of friendships there in those few months that I still have today and learned a ton about kind of how those transitions happen and how important those kind of peaceful transitions from one administration to the next are.
Is that where you learned about the inner workings of policy and politics of being in that transition team?
Yeah, I mean, I think between that and then, after inauguration, I got my clearance and started at the state and then kind of had a couple of years of working in a few different parts of the federal government. Being able to see up close how that stuff works is really interesting, both the policy but also the personalities and how those two things kind of meld and end up guiding decisions and guiding history in a lot of ways.
And I'm sure when you were in the White House as a presidential management fellow, you saw quite a bit of egos and internal politics.
Yeah, I worked in the Office of Energy and Climate Change, and it was during the push for passing it was called the ACES Act. It was like a cap and trade climate change bill. We were pushing to pass that in the House, and it ended up passing by like a handful of votes. Unfortunately, it didn't end up passing in the Senate, but that was such a cool experience. You're kind of triangulating between all the different presidential advisors and staffers, plus you're doing a bunch of outreach to the Hill and trying to figure out like what's relevant in the bill for each member and his district. And you really get a sense of, I guess one thing I'd say is government's not a monolith. They're like anything. They're really good people and really bad people and everybody in between. But yeah, you learn up close, I guess they say how the sausage is made.
And from the White House to self-driving trucks, how did that transition happen?
Yeah, so, I did a bunch of different things when I was in government. So I actually started my career working on nuclear nonproliferation issues in South Asia. So I was working on India, Pakistan nuclear stuff at state. And then I went over to the White House and worked on energy and climate change. And then I also worked in the Pentagon on energy security issues. I left the government and I was trying to figure out kind of like what made sense, like what was the thread that went through all the different things that I had done. And I realized it was kind of this intersection of policy and regulation and then technology. So with like nuclear stuff, there's like the nuclear fuel cycle, and you have to understand how that works before you can start to, create rules about how to stop the spread of weapons. Same thing with clean energy. You need to really understand how the science works behind it. So I ended up working on a consulting project essentially for an insurance company that was trying to figure out more about self-driving cars and how it would affect the insurance industry. This was, a number of years ago before self-driving vehicles were a really big thing. But I just fell in love with the idea. I thought it was going to be just such a game changer. The technology, it seemed like the pieces of the puzzle were there, and it was just kind of waiting for people to put it together. And then being a policy wonk, you kind of realize what the implications are for this huge kind of regulatory environment that was never intended to deal with self-driving vehicles. It always assumed a human in the car or in the truck, and how much work there was going to be to kind of adapt that to this new world. And so I got super excited about it, and just kind of started looking for opportunities to get more deeply involved with the industry.
Today, you're now head of public policy for Embark. When you meet with elected officials and staff, how do you describe to them what an autonomous truck is?
It's an interesting challenge. I mean, I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there about self-driving trucks and automated trucks. And, I think there's a tendency for a lot of hype to be around it. And I think some of that is the fault of industry, and some of that is the fault of, media. And some of it is just people getting really excited or concerned about a big change. So the first thing I try and do is figure out kind of what they've heard about self-driving trucks, what their impressions are from the outset. And because you can find people who say, this stuff isn't going to happen for 30 years. You can find people who are going to say it's happening next year. And then, there will be millions of self-driving trucks on the road in the next couple of years. And I try and root them in kind of what our experience is being on the front lines and actually developing the technology. And just, it's happening, it's coming, but it is very hard. It is very complicated. And so I think you'll see, what I usually say is it's going to happen sooner than most people think, but it's going to take a longer time to kind of diffuse throughout the trucking industry than most people think. It's not going to be an instant change.
Did you learn the balance between misconceptions and the impressions of the public at state where you're working on major global issues and how to delicately balance everything?
Yeah, I mean, I think for anybody who's involved in policy, I think, you're dealing with stuff that is relevant to the general public, whether it's clean energy or nuclear weapons or self-driving trucks. There are things that the average citizen is going to care about because it affects them. And it's easy to kind of forget that when you're in it, when you're in the weeds, when you're, building your expertise, it's easy to lose sight of like what people know and don't know. And you have a responsibility as someone who works in policy to make sure that you're bringing the average citizen along with you. It's not enough to kind of say like, I have all the answers, just trust me. You need to kind of be able to walk people through and say like, look, this is what it is. This is what it isn't. And to do that, you need to have credibility. You can't be out there kind of making all these crazy claims about, we're going to have self-driving trucks next year and there's going to be thousands. And then next year comes and you don't follow through. So there's a huge educational piece that, the industry is doing and kind of continues to do as we get closer to deployment.
And as you get closer to deployment, what are some of the biggest hurdles that are facing the industry?
From the policy perspective, a couple of things. I mean, first of all, again, you're kind of dealing with a bunch of both state and federal laws and regulations that never really anticipated this technology. So some of it is working with officials, whether it's, state police and highway patrol, legislators at the state and federal level, or, DOT regulators, to kind of help them understand the technology and help create a dialogue around like, how do we apply these traditional rules to this new technology? And then, if there are certain things that don't fit, what needs to change in a way that kind of maintains safety, but allows for innovation. So I think actually the federal government's done a great job of looking at all of like the trucking regulations and seeing how those interact with self-driving technology. At the state level, it's a challenge because each state is wrestling with how they're going to deal with this stuff. And the industry talks a lot about the challenges of having a patchwork of a bunch of states doing different things on automated vehicles. And that's even worse for trucks that have to operate on an interstate basis. So when you're driving from California to Arizona to New Mexico to Texas, facing 4 different kind of testing rules and regulations and things like that is just really untenable. And that's why traditionally in trucking, a lot of the regulation has happened at the federal level to allow for that interstate flow of commerce.
You mentioned having challenges at the state level. What are your thoughts on Missouri State Representative Mike Moon, who introduced Bill 2059, which would basically stop self-driving trucks dead in their tracks? How do you educate or have a conversation with an individual like this that is determined to completely derail an industry that will create hundreds of thousands of jobs around the United States as the technology matures?
Yeah, I think there are always going to be people who are resistant to change for whatever the reason. In my experience, most lawmakers, understand that we didn't become a global economic power by, turning our backs on innovation and banning certain types of technology before they're even fully developed. So I think, I've found that bill is a bit of an outlier, and I don't think it had a tremendous amount of support. Sometimes people put draft bills out there to just kind of float an idea or get some attention. But I found most lawmakers to be incredibly receptive to the promise of self-driving trucks. And certainly there are a lot of lawmakers that have concerns. And, it's our job to kind of alleviate those concerns and address those concerns. But, I think there's a general consensus in the country that, is kind of across both parties and in pretty much every state that, innovation generally is a good thing. Innovation generally is a job creator. If you look, you can find articles from 100 years ago where, the nascent horseless carriage industry was going through the same challenges. And there are always kind of battles to be fought at the beginning of the birth of any industry. But, I think we can, you get through them, and education is a big part of it.
And when you have a politician that's looking for attention, how do you stop that from becoming a trend where it spreads to all 50 states?
I don't know if there's a politician who's not looking for attention, but, I think all politicians are, at the end of the day, trying to be responsive to their constituents. Right. And so, and trucking and truck drivers are in, every state, every locality. And so it's our job to kind of explain, how our technology is going to fit with this, inside this massive $800 billion trucking industry that employs a lot of people. And I think there are a lot of articles at the beginning of this journey that I think did quite a disservice to the technology, because they just kind of said, hey, there's, X amount of truck drivers. And if you have self-driving trucks, then that means like X amount of people out of business. And I think anybody who knows the trucking industry knows that it is not a monolith. It is, there are a ton of different types of trucking jobs, and truck drivers do a lot of work that isn't driving. And so what we're doing is we're developing, one specific tool that is one tool in a toolkit to move freight around, but it's not a tool that works in every situation. It's not going to be a tool that replaces all other tools. One of the questions I get a lot is kind of like, well, what is your truck going to do when it's going over the mountains hauling, nuclear waste in a snowstorm? And I say, well, first of all, I don't think any truck should be in that situation, but that's probably not a good use case for this technology. There are things that it's well suited to do and things that it's not, at this point.
You brought up a very valid point, and I want to dig into this and emphasize this, that a lot of work done in the trucking industry is not done with actually driving. Could you share some examples of some of those jobs?
Yeah, sure. So, I think first of all, it's useful to explain how, the Embark model works, which is a transfer hub model. So what we're doing is we're taking, the strengths of the driver, which is, kind of improvisation and customer service and things like that, leveraging those strengths, and then taking the strengths of the automated system, which is, it doesn't get tired, it doesn't get distracted. It can operate for hours without a break, or even days. And so basically the idea is you have human drivers that are taking loads on local and regional routes, off highway, picking things up, dropping things off at the last mile. And then they're going to transfer hubs and transferring that trailer, that load, to a self-driving truck that's able to do what we call the middle mile. So the really boring interstate driving that humans kind of get bored with and fall asleep and get distracted and things like that. And then at the end of that journey, the self-driving truck then transfers that load back to a human driver that can take it the last mile. And so, there are so many shippers, so many fleets rely on that human contact, whether it's inspecting freight, dealing with bills of lading, taking cargo through very tricky routes between a distribution center or a warehouse and the highway. And we think those jobs are here to stay. That's stuff that's really hard to automate. And the nice thing is that, the goal here is to keep drivers in jobs that let them be close to their homes and families. Long haul trucking is probably the hardest job in the trucking industry. People are away from home, weeks at a time. You see a lot of people that do it for a year and then drop out and try and find other jobs in the industry, even if they're, not paid as well, because it's just so hard. It's hard on health. It's hard on relationships. And if we can kind of automate that stuff and create demand for drivers at the local and regional levels, I think that could be a win-win for both drivers and technology developers.
It's also a win for the local community as well, because these individuals can go to church on Sunday. They can go to little league games and be an active part of their community. I think another important part with your strategy to point out is that you'll have little economic booms where there's more money going to a hamburger stand or more money going to the local grocery store instead of being spent in other regions. So it'll benefit that community where those individuals live. I'd love to dive into, why did Embark embrace on a transfer hub strategy instead of trying to do the complete journey yourselves?
Yeah, I think baked into to the Embark DNA is really a sense of pragmatism. And I think in the technology industry, there's a certain culture of wanting to be incredibly bold and wanting to say you're, changing the world and boiling the ocean and doing all the things. And one of the things that really attracted me to Embark's founding team is they said, you know what, we're not going to try and do everything. What we're going to try and do is find the most straightforward, commercially viable application of self-driving technology. And that's in trucking, and specifically in long haul interstate trucking. And we're going to focus on that specific problem and solve it. Any great company is really they're solving a problem that needs solving. And we saw that as the application that made the most sense for the technology, given its strengths and weaknesses. It's a really capital intensive technology that we're developing. And, you don't need to make it more complicated for yourself than it needs to be. So we saw, that particular solution is, not easy, but easier than trying to do everything that drivers can do everywhere. And that's really our approach. And then we'll build off that.
And as you develop this technology, is Embark currently generating revenue, or is everything fully being just testing and no commercialization yet?
Yeah. So, when we do our testing on road, we are generally moving freight for shippers. So we are generating revenue from that. It's not kind of, we're not bootstrapping the company. We have some great venture capital investors that, really give our company its lifeblood. We are technically generating revenue. And, the reason why we're moving freight is there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that it's not enough to just build this technology. This technology has to live and be successful in a pre-existing massive logistics ecosystem. And so we need to get the experience of how this technology actually works in that ecosystem. So it's one thing for the truck to drive itself, without a trailer down the road and that looks cool and we can pat ourselves on the back. But, building those relationships with shippers, understanding their needs, understanding how fleets operate, understanding how, loads get transferred and picked up and dropped off is all critical information to us. And then the second reason is, when you're talking about wanting to be safe in testing, if we can take a truck off the road that otherwise would be moving that load while we're testing, that's a win both on a safety perspective because there's one less vehicle on the road, and it's a win on an emissions perspective for the same reason. So instead of adding a bunch of empty miles on our trucks because we're testing, if we can kind of actually be doing stuff that's productive while we're testing, I think that's a win for the communities where we test as well as for our company.
It's definitely a win. In 2008, when you completed the first ever level 2 coast-to-coast journey from Los Angeles to Jacksonville, was there freight goods in the back of that truck?
So that was 2018.
2018, yes.
Yeah, so that was that we weren't moving freight on that run, mostly because we couldn't find a load that needed to go to those specific points. So usually freight isn't going all the way from coast to coast. Usually they will just bring whatever it is into that side of the country. But so that was with a trailer, but not with goods that belong to a shipper.
What did you have to do from a policy perspective to make that possible?
So, I mean, there's a lot of kind of background work that goes into something like that. I mean, when I came to Embark, I think I was the lucky 13th employee. We were kind of, it was a small group in a very small garage and one truck. And so the first thing you do is you need to make sure, we did a top to bottom review to make sure that we were being compliant with all the existing regulations. So, where are the sensors placed? Did a deep dive on all of the trucking regulations to make sure that what we wanted to do were compliant. And then, from there, it was kind of building out relationships with all the relevant states. So I would go and brief the relevant agencies, whether it was the state DOT, state police. We'd obviously do a deep dive on each state's vehicle code to make sure that there was nothing that would prevent us from operating. But then in addition to that, we wanted to reach out proactively to states and build relationships and make sure that, they were aware and that we could answer any questions that they had. So there was, a lot of relationship building that goes into it because we try and have what we call a no surprises policy with our government partners. We don't want to do something and then have them learn about it in the newspaper, which is also why, anytime we're doing like public press release about something, we've kind of briefed in advance the relevant state partners so that they know what it is. They're prepared to answer questions if they get questions from the public. And I think because of that approach, I think we've been able to build some good relationships and continue to thrive.
Formerly being the co-chair for the Autonomous Vehicle Task Force for the City of Beverly Hills, our policy was no surprises, and it worked really well for us. So I commend you on that policy that you're doing at Embark. When will we see a press release of Embark doing a level 4 run cross country?
That is probably the question I get the most. We have another policy in addition to our no surprises policy, which is the no crystal balls policy. So, the challenge with building a self-driving vehicle is it's never been done before. And, there are the things that that you don't know, and there are the things that you don't know that you don't know. And so that makes it really hard to say, okay, well, in 2 years' time, we're going to be completely ready and completely confident. And obviously, as we've seen on the passenger vehicle side as well, like there are a lot of very optimistic predictions that were made, 5 years ago that if they were true, you and I would be driving around in level 4 passenger vehicles right now. And that's, with a couple very narrow exceptions, that's not really something that we can do yet. So, we have an internal roadmap that's not as much time-based as it is milestone-based. So we know kind of what we need to see. There are a lot of things as you're developing this technology that tell you that you're not ready, but there's not like this one thing that says like, okay, we're totally ready. So I think it's going to be combination of us developing internally, but then also there's the other piece of it, which is making sure that just because you think you're ready to deploy a level 4 truck or car, the public, the government also needs to agree with you. And so, we're constantly having that dialogue so that when we get to that point internally, we're not just kind of like surprise, like we're ready, coming out of stealth type of thing, but we've built the relationships and we've been giving information to the right people along that journey so that when we get to the end of it, again, there are no surprises.
No surprises is really smart. And I want to dive into milestones because Embark's celebrating a big milestone now with Big Blue. Big Blue turned 4 this month. What have you learned over those 4 years? And if you wouldn't mind, could you just give our listeners a high-level overview of who Big Blue is and everything that Big Blue's been able to achieve over these 4 years?
Yeah, so, Big Blue is, the first truck that was ever purchased by Embark. So it's got this kind of sentimental value. It's actually kind of not, one of the trucks that we're using on a regular basis down in our operations center in Southern California anymore. Big Blue lives up in San Francisco, and it's kind of a little bit of like a test platform. And it's the truck that if you've ever been to Embark and had a demo ride in a truck, it was probably in Big Blue. But yeah, I mean, when we think about kind of where we were at as a company when Big Blue was first purchased and we had one driver, and then our COO, got his commercial driver's license. And there was kind of this whole universe of trucking knowledge that, we still had to learn to where we are now. I mean, there's been so much growth, both in terms of understanding the trucking industry, understanding the potential of these vehicles, working with our OEM and tier one supplier partners to better understand, the key systems, and then also, the sensors and everything else. So we put a video out yesterday of Big Blue getting a new sensor upgrade. And, the first sensor rack, I'm sure people have probably seen pictures of it, was this big, 80/20 metal thing that was kind of monstrous up on top with, cameras and big security camera enclosures. And we're now on our third generation of sensors. And not only does it look a lot better and a lot cleaner and doesn't scream like, there's something crazy going on with this truck, but, the sensors on it are also able to see much farther, much more reliably, and so forth. There was at one point, Big Blue pulled into a truck stop. It had like 4 or 6 or something cameras, security looking cameras on the top of it. And this guy comes out of the truck stop and says like, what are you guys hauling that you need all those security cameras up there? Like, and then, we had like a couple engineers in the truck, and usually trucks are driven by like one person, and like 4 people get out of the cab, and he's just like, never mind, I don't want to know, and like walked away. So we have a little bit less of that these days.
That's funny. You could have told him, yeah, we're hauling gold to Fort Knox.
Yeah, exactly. That's certainly what it looked like.
That's funny. So you mentioned your COO has a CDL to further enhance your policy. Have you gotten a CDL to learn?
I haven't yet. That's kind of on the bucket list. And I've actually been, kind of involved in the trucking industry now for, I think, over, something like 7 years. But I have not had the time and opportunity needed to kind of like practice that stuff. So I could tell you all about kind of the regulations that govern a commercial driver, but I have not had the experience behind the wheel. It's something I would like to do in the future for sure.
Okay, so you got the schoolwork, book work done, so you're halfway there.
Yeah.
Let's pivot back to jobs for a minute. In 2018, just 6.6% of truck drivers were women, according to the American Trucking Associations.
Yep.
What job opportunities will there be for women in the autonomous trucking industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, women in the trucking industry is a really interesting topic. There's actually a great nonprofit called Women in Trucking that kind of advocates for a number of different policies and industry changes that would help attract and support women in the industry. And I think it's such a laudable goal. I mean, even things as kind of, fundamental as making sure that OEMs are making the controls in the truck and in the cabin something that works for, the average physical dimensions of a woman versus a man. That seems like something basic, but a lot of times in the development cycles, that's not something that's considered. But obviously something core, if you can't reach certain things in the cab, it's really hard to be a driver. In terms of, how the self-driving industry is going to change that, I think one, we've talked about kind of jobs becoming more local jobs where people can go to sleep in their bed every night. I certainly think that, for both men and women, long haul trucking, where you're sleeping in your truck alone at truck stops in random places for weeks on end, certainly has some, people have safety concerns about that. So the idea of having a population of jobs that allows you to be more local, I think could certainly attract women into the industry a little bit more. But, I think with a lot of this stuff, and, tech has similar challenges of needing more gender diversity as well as other types of diversity. It doesn't start with just saying, okay, we need to hire women more, at the end point. You have to start upstream to make sure that you're engaging people that otherwise might not think about those industries as a career. And so I think, my hope is that self-driving trucks can help kind of modernize the industry a little bit more and make it a little bit more accessible to people from different backgrounds with different interests. Truck driver hasn't historically been seen as like a particularly like tech forward profession, but I think as you're seeing that change a lot now, both with the, driver assist technologies that are starting to be available today. Trucks are looking a lot more technology enabled, and then certainly as self-driving trucks come online.
Do you think one of the reasons that's historically kept women away from the trucking industry is because the workplace fatality rates are the highest according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that they just say this is not a safe place for me to have a long, sustainable career?
Those statistics are certainly true, and truck driving is, compared to most professions, quite a bit more dangerous. It would be, I don't want to speculate why women are or aren't, attracted to trucking. not having that experience myself, but I think man or woman, it's a tremendous concern. And I think a lot of fleets today spend a lot of time thinking about how they can keep their drivers safer. And certainly something that we spend a lot of time on, both the drivers that we employ as test drivers. And then once, our trucks are on the road, self-driving, how are we improving the safety of the industry, of the people that work on and around the trucks, as well as the people that drive next to the trucks?
That's impressive. Let's continue this policy track and let's talk about hours of service.
Mm-hmm.
What are the benefits for removing those rules for level 4 autonomous trucks?
The benefits are really tremendous. And I think, when people think about why one would want to have a self-driving truck, I think a lot of people go to a pretty basic calculation of, well, you have to pay a driver. And if you don't have a driverless truck, you don't have to pay the driver. And that's kind of the benefit. Really, I think the hours of service issue is as important, if not more important. So, right now we've decided as a society that we're not okay with truck drivers driving beyond, I think it's 11 hours in a 13-hour period. And there's a bunch of kind of, rest breaks that are required and so forth. But basically you're trying to manage human fatigue, right? And there are statistics that show kind of both at the beginning of a shift and at the end of a shift, you're much more likely to have a crash. And certainly at the end, as if you've been driving 11 hours, you're tired, it takes a lot of concentration, a lot of mental focus to drive that long safely. And so, a lot of the logistics system is built around how far you can drive a truck within hours of service. And so, it takes something moving on a truck coast to coast, 5 or 6 days because you have to stop, you have to rest and so forth. Now, if you have a self-driving truck, those trucks aren't, if there's no human involved in its operation, then hours of service regulations don't apply. And that's something that's been clarified by the FMCSA, the truck regulator. And that's a huge boon for both the trucking industry because you can have trucks that operate for longer. So you're covering more ground in a 24-hour period. And then it's also a boon for all the industries that rely on shipping things via truck, especially things like perishable goods. So if you imagine, the agricultural sector in California or, dairy farmers in Wisconsin, they're able to move their goods on truck only so far in a certain amount of time based on hours of service. And now we're expanding that radius out, making new markets available to them, getting fresh goods to market faster. So reducing how much spoilage there is in, food supply chains, things like that. So I think that can have tremendous impacts on a number of different industries and also help with kind of the overall global competitiveness. If we can move things around the country faster while maintaining the same or better level of safety and, having it be cheaper, I think all that stuff is a huge benefit to the economy writ large.
I agree with the economic as 43% of the trucking cost is labor. When a consumer goes to the store, and we're in a COVID world now, to buy Clorox wipes or toilet paper, will that item be cheaper if it's sent completely on a self-driving truck since the cost of labor is removed?
So ideally, I think the reality is a little bit more complicated than that. And I'm not an economist, so I haven't built the economic model that shows where the kind of, profit savings ends up living. But I think there's, I don't want to represent it like it's a one-to-one, like, okay, all of a sudden you're not paying the driver and you just save 43% because there's, potentially other roles that will be involved in the operation of self-driving vehicles that don't exist for vehicles today, whether it's kind of, more people at remote locations that are kind of monitoring the health and operation of these trucks from afar, additional technicians that, are making sure to a much more rigorous degree that before these trucks leave the depot that they're safe and operational and everything is in adjustment and so forth. So I think the economic picture isn't completely clear. So that's like the long-winded answer. And the short answer is like, yes, there will be savings both in cost and in time that will accrue like throughout the economy. So if you're a manufacturer of a good in America that needs a number of different inputs that all move on truck, whether it's steel or, aluminum or something else, and all that stuff can get to you faster and cheaper, then your costs are going to go down. And then, that means you're able to pass those savings on to the consumer, or you're able to, pass the savings maybe onto your workers. There are a lot of different options, but creating that savings is, I think, a good thing for a broad swath of people.
There's a lot of benefits to it. If we can lower the cost of goods, you can dramatically improve somebody's life, or you can pay them a higher wage. So it's very good. You mentioned in that remote locations to monitor trucks. Do you see those being strategically placed around the United States, like an Air Force base, or will they be in a central command hub? Do you have any thoughts on that strategy that you can share?
I mean, I can speak generally about it, which is to say, I think this is an area of self-driving technology that still needs a lot of development. And I think part of the reason why there aren't more kind of details about it, a type of problem that you only have to deal with kind of when you're close to the end, when you're saying, okay, the trucks themselves are almost ready. Now we need that layer on top of them. I mean, right now we have, a lot of oversight of the trucks as they're on the road, both remotely and then, in the trucks with, people that are doing data annotation and so forth. What that looks like when kind of self-driving trucks are, deployed without anybody in it, there, I think, is a spectrum of different roles you can imagine, from kind of like an air traffic controller role that's kind of looking at a network of trucks and, noting if there are any anomalies in the operation, to things that look a little bit more like teleoperations, where someone is kind of, if a truck is needing guidance, they can provide some inputs to that vehicle, whether it's, one-to-one kind of steering the vehicle from afar, or whether it's kind of helping to annotate and identify objects or obstacles and show a truck, the path that it should take. There's a big area where there's not a lot of industry accepted standards or jargon or anything like that. And it's all fairly theoretical at this point, but it'll be interesting to see how it develops as we get closer to deployment.
Definitely will be. And now we're getting really close to a presidential election in November. And as we look to wrap up this wonderful conversation, I want to bring it full circle. You worked in the White House during the Obama administration, and now that Joe Biden has accepted the Democratic nominee for president, what advice would you like to give to Vice President Biden to share with him about autonomy and autonomous trucks?
Yeah. I don't know if Joe Biden needs my advice. He's a pretty smart guy, and I'm sure he has a pretty smart team around him. But, what I tell anybody in a position to help determine the future of the industry is, we have a number of companies in our industry, both Embark and a number of our competitors, who are proactively reaching out to the public sector, to the executive agencies, to Congress, to state legislatures. And this is not the old kind of move fast and break things ethos of Silicon Valley that we've seen in the past. I think there are a lot of companies that really get it, that, hey, we're looking to innovate an industry that's already highly regulated, that the public has a big stake in, and we need to kind of do the right thing and be as communicative as possible. And so I think what I'd tell any administration, and I think the current one gets this, and I would imagine that if there's a change, that the Biden administration would also get this, is, we need to work together to figure out what is a common sense approach of creating oversight on the industry, but doing it in a way that doesn't hamper innovation. I think the benefits of self-driving vehicles and specifically self-driving trucks are too important to safety, to global economic competitiveness to ignore, or to outright prohibit because, special interests don't like change. So regardless of the administration, regardless of the party, we're always looking for partners that can help us, in good faith, build that future. And I think it's incumbent upon us to understand that people in government, their job isn't to kind of make us successful. Their job is to protect public safety and the public interest. And it's our kind of responsibility to respect that. And I think, on that basis, we're able to have really good cooperation with a wide range of states as well as with the federal government.
And as we've heard here on the Road to Autonomy podcast, government and industry must work together to enable the future of innovation. And Jonny's background in policy is helping shape how Embark is able to deliver autonomous trucks. So Jonny, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today and sharing your wonderful insights on policy and all things trucks with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Grayson, and thanks for your role in the industry as such a great subject matter expert and convener. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
You as well. Thanks so much. Thank you for listening to the Road to Autonomy podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter @Road to Autonomy or email podcast@BR BRULTECO.com. The Road to Autonomy is produced by Brulte and Company. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Brulte and Company. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal, tax, investment, or business advice.